long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Duke Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. My name is constant reader Scott Daly, and coming live from the door inside your head, it's my co-host, Matt Freeman. How's it going, Matt?
Tooter Fish Popkin.
Oh, Matt, I'm so excited about this. I've been waiting to start this book since we started the last book.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why now that we're here.
Yeah, this week on the show, we are going to begin Book 2 of the Dark Tower series, titled The Drawing of the Three. This week on the show, we'll be discussing Part 1 all the way through Chapter 3. So this book is divided into 3 parts, and we're going through Chapter 3 of Part 1, called Contact and Landing. In this week's reading, Stephen King demonstrates the quality of Maine lobster by having one of them chop the fingers off his hero. Then we meet Eddie Dean, the prisoner, a drug-smuggling junkie flying back to the States with some cocaine stuffed in his armpits. Roland connects with Eddie via a beachside interdimensional doorway as they smuggle some drugs right out of thin air. Matt, what did you think of these few chapters?
I think I'm beginning to see why this series is so great, you know? I mean, The Gunslinger was very fun. I was on board for it. It was odd, it was strange, it was interesting. But this book, it just kind of takes it brings everything up another level, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
like sort of every dimension is just like, oh, I think I get it now. This is gonna be a fun ride.
It is. I mean, and I think you're right. The Gunslinger was a very interesting book. It has a lot to say, I think, and there's a lot to dive into and explore. I still think that remains true for every book in the series, including this one, but it's also way more fun. There's way more fun shit happening. And not to take anything away from the Gunslinger, but like this week's chapter has our cowboy hero going inside the head of a guy on an airplane and smuggling drugs through like an interdimensional portal. It's insane. I think you literally texted me like interdimensional drug smuggling, and that's all you said to me. It's just like that one thing as you were reading.
Yeah, I think I typed the word delightful in the script at least 5 times today.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah. All right, well, let's waste no further time and get right into our reading this week.
Cool.
So before we started the book, I kind of wanted to do that thing where we give back some information on the book. The Drawing of the Three was published in 1987, 5 years after The Gunslinger. So Dark Tower fans had to wait like half a George R.R. Martin for this book. Unlike The Gunslinger, the book was conceived and written as one complete novel. So this is not a collection of short stories or anything. I think by the time King was putting together those 5 short stories in 1982, he had basically decided, yep, this is going to be a series. I'm going to do it. So this is the first book that is conceived as a novel from beginning to end. I think like this, the result of that is this book is much more in line like what you would expect from not only a book in this series, but a Stephen King book in general. And I think the best example of that is Eddie Dean, who is just like a quintessential Stephen King character, like in every possible way.
He really is. He reminds me, like I said, I've only read a couple of other books, but he already reminds me of specific characters from those books.
Yeah.
So this is a very comfortable groove, but I feel like I don't know what to say other than better than those other characters I'm comparing him to. He's just more fleshed out, more likable, more interesting.
Yeah. I think that the fun thing about him is like we don't get too much time with him in this section, but we already see the kernels of a lot of interesting things that we're going to explore about him. His relationship with his brother is very quickly established in this section as a very interesting thing. And I'm excited for us to talk about that more as we go through the book.
Me too. So, you know, this book already seems just different, right? In almost every way than The Gunslinger. We have different tone, we have different setting, we have new point of view characters. I mean, I feel a bit vindicated in thinking that the story would take a direction that continued to play with expectations and with genre, because that's certainly what we're seeing here.
Yeah, 100%. And I think at the end of the last book, you predicted that Roland is going to walk out of the mountain and into our world. And you weren't quite right, but most of this week's reading takes place in an airplane. So we are kind of transitioning into not Roland's area.
Yeah, it seems like I make a lot of predictions that are like, well, no, that you got it just perfectly wrong, actually, Matt.
No, just close. You're very close. Very close.
Yeah, close doesn't count for a gunslinger, though.
Sure. And I think it's just a good thing to note that, like, yes, it took 5 hours for Stephen King. 5 years for Stephen King to return to the series, but in between The Gunslinger and The Drawing of the Three, King released Christine, Pet Sematary, The Talisman, It, The Eyes of the Dragon, Misery. Some of those books are going to play into the Dark Tower in interesting ways, some more importantly than others. But that's to say that, like, in between these two novels, he wrote some of his most well-known books, like It, Pet Sematary, Misery are some of King's most well-known novels. And so while I made a George R. R. Martin joke at the beginning, he was writing a whole lot. So I think one of the cool things we're going to see here is he's just a better writer because he's been writing a lot in between these, and I think is more comfortable with his style.
Dear God, the man is a machine.
Yeah, he doesn't. I think 4 books came out the year this book came out.
Oh my God! So basically, King wrote this book at what might be called the height of his career. Like, I mean, at least I recognize most of these books as being amongst his most well-known books. Like, many of them, more than half of them, went on to become films, right? So, like, do you think? So you know King really well. Like, does he have a point in his career that you would consider like this was when he was at his best?
I mean, it takes different. That's tough. I think this is like It is one of my favorite books. The Stand was a few years before this, so it does not fall in this period, and that's one of my favorite King books as well. I think he's got in every period in his career, he's got really, really good books and not so good books. The thing about this period of his career is this is kind of the high point, or I guess the low point of his struggle with addiction. Needful Things, the only book that you've read, is his first book that he wrote completely sober. And that came out in 1991, I believe. So like 90 or 87, 88, when this book comes out, he's really, like, I think he's at this point trying to get sober, but not quite there yet. So I think there's a lot of manic craziness in the books in this period, cocaine craziness. But I don't know. For some reason, I'm very hesitant to say, yes, this is absolutely the best part of his career, even though every book I just listed for you, I love. I think The Talisman is one that I'm a little bit more so on, but every other book in this list I just adore. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't even know what I was going to do with that information. I was just curious because, I mean, of all the authors that I'm obsessed with, I definitely have strong opinions about the arc of their career. So I was just wondering if there was, but yeah, not that matters. It's just cool to know that he was really on kind of a hot streak when he wrote this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I was trying to be completely objective, which is impossible with this author, I would say that, like, some of the books in the late 2000s, that decade, is probably some of his weakest, although some of his 1990 stuff, I don't know. I'll have to think about this more to give you a good answer.
We'll come back to this.
Yeah. So one thing before we move into the story proper, though, this book, like all other books that in the Dark Tower series after this point, includes what King calls an argument, which is really just a summary of the story so far. Matt, you and I have talked, I think, on many of our other podcasts about the ways in which authors write sequels to their long-running series, like how they remind the reader of where we were, what was going on, what happened last time, especially those that are like along for the ride and waiting 5 years between entries, like people had to do for these books. King's strategy here is like a combination, right? Because I think he does this summary at the start that basically is like a quick 1-pager about what happened in The Gunslinger, but also like the first parts of the prologue serve to, I think, remind us of some of Roland's exploits. Like, I think it's like we specifically focus on Jake as one of the most important things that happened in the last book that Roland is still dealing with in the prologue. So I think he does a little bit of both.
Yeah. It's funny is I skipped this argument section the first time because I was just confused by it. And I had to go back and read it after I had read all of the rest of the reading for this week. And, I guess it was good. I don't feel like I missed anything by skipping it. I can see the reasoning behind including it, but it didn't seem necessary to me personally.
Yeah. I don't think these are going to be necessary for us to read at all during this project. I think we're going to be reading close enough and consistently enough that we're not going to have to remind ourselves. But I do think there's interesting things that kind of fall out of this. This one section, when I reread it, really stood out to me, where King is talking about what else we know based on this book. And he says, "We know that Roland was forced into an early trial of manhood after discovering that his mother had become the mistress of Martin, a much greater sorcerer than Walter, who, unknown to Roland's father, is Martin's ally. We know Martin has planned Roland's discovery, expecting Roland to fail and to be sent west. We know that Roland triumphs in his test." So this is really interesting to me, because I remember you and I having a conversation last book about what we thought Martin was doing with, like, basically bragging to Roland about this relationship with his mother. And I think you and I kind of settled on it could be either he planned for him to fail or he actually planned for him to succeed. And this was some long-term Ka-based move to send him on his path.
Yeah.
And it seems like King here is like deciding that for us. And he didn't do that in the previous book. I read this book 4 times. We read it very closely over the last month. That definitely is not stated outright in that book.
I mean, not only is that not in the book, but Martin is Walter. That is stated explicitly in the book. That is so. I mean, maybe this bit of text in the drawing of the 3 didn't get properly revised when King ultimately later went back and edited the Gunslinger to say that they were the same person. I'm really confused, and almost borderline considering this to be non-canonical because it's not really part of the book anyway.
I think that is a fine thing to do. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that if you spend some time researching this book is that King was very inconsistent about these 2 characters and their status as being the same person or not being the same person. And I think maybe it's very possible we just got an oopsie here. Or maybe it's just like him changing his mind, or he's just trying to throw you off. I don't know. But I think it's fine to just look at this and say, toss it away. And I think this is probably the last time I'll bring up the summaries for the rest of the series, because I see no point in them. I just thought we should establish that it exists this first time. This
paragraph you've pulled out, though, is just strange to the point of being fascinating, because there's stuff like Martin is a much greater sorcerer than Walter. Not only are they the same person, but there's nothing in the text that would have suggested that Martin was a much greater sorcerer than Walter in the first place.
Sure.
So it's like fractally confusing to me. But
yeah.
Anyway, we'll let that pass. It's not real.
There's the meta question that, like, where is this coming from, right? Like, is this Stephen King talking to us, or is this something else within the world of the story?
That's the kind of thing that I want to. Yeah, I'm like, what was the point of writing? Like why include these details? These seem like really inconsequential details. So, are you trying to draw our attention to them? Or I get. Yeah. I'm gonna get weird about it now. So maybe we should move on, and maybe this will strike us 3 books from now. We'll be like, oh my God, that's why he put that in there.
Yeah. I think we'll do the thing we hate saying, but I'll put a pin in it, and we'll maybe circle back around to that later if it comes up again.
And maybe that pin will just stay there forever.
It might. All right, so we open with our prologue, and this novel opens right where the last one we left off, with our protagonist Roland Deschain, the last gunslinger, sitting on the western beach on the other side of the mountains. He's sleeping when the book opens. He's sleeping and he's dreaming of Jake, the boy he sacrificed to his quest. But in this dream, Roland is the sailor, the tarot card that signifies Jake. He is Jake. He's not sacrificing him. He is the one being sacrificed. And the text is really interesting here because it opens with, he found this a relief because it would be far better to drown as Jake than to live as himself, a man who had, for a cold dream, betrayed a child who had trusted him. And I love that opening.
Yeah. So, we left off the last book feeling kind of mad at Roland, kind of disgusted.
Yeah.
And here, like, what we're seeing is at least he feels bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that emotional reaction makes me suspect that I'm already getting a bad case of protagonist goggles. Because, like, as this story moves along, as this first part of the book we're reading moves along, you really get swept up in the moment. What Roland did to Jake kind of fades from being this fresh emotional insult into just being an abstract fact that we know about his backstory. And the author basically has a chance to kind of overwrite how we're supposed to feel about things. And I think this happens a lot in books in general. And I'm really fascinated by this process. I think it's particularly salient for books with bad guy protagonists, which you might call Roland.
Sure.
And it's been something like a couple weeks since he killed Jake like an asshole. And I'm already like, well, he feels guilty, so that's nice. Like I'm eager to forgive and get over it. Like 'cause I want to just go on this fun adventure with this guy. And I don't think it's just me, by the way. I think that's either intended or King knows that that's the effect that's going to occur by proceeding in this way with this character.
I think he does. And I think you're absolutely right here. Like, I do think that a lot of what King is doing very early in this novel is kind of trying to reset. Maybe reset's not the right word, but like kind of manipulate our understanding of Roland to the point where we sympathize with him a little more. Like, you're absolutely right. Like, we talked about how crazy it is to have your protagonist kill a kid or by choice of inaction let a child die. And that is not something that endears you to the character. And frankly, like, I love Roland. I have foresight of the rest of this book, and just general, like, being a kid and reading this book in which a guy has 2 guns and he's a badass. So I've like always loved Roland from the very beginning. And I've been surprised at we have some first time readers following along with us. And I've been surprised at like how negative their reaction to Roland was. And I've had to kind of step back from that surprise and be like, no, like if all you know of this character is those moments, it makes total sense that you completely hate this guy.
Yeah.
But I don't think King wants you to hate him, or at least not like, I don't think he wants that hatred to feel like to lay itself over every interaction from this point on in the book. That was a thing. It happened. It was awful. And here in the first part of this book, it's like time to punish Roland for it, right? Because we have this mental anguish that we open the story with here, and then we're almost immediately going to move into physical punishment, where he will be literally punished like physically, and you could say for what he did. It's not explicit, but you could say that. Right.
Yeah, you're right. Not only does he feel bad, but he gets punished, right? You feel like maybe this is a kind of justice, and then you think, oh, okay, good. Now I don't have to be so mad at him. He's being punished.
Yeah, and I think one of the fun things to do right now is to be like, okay, so what if Roland had saved Jake? And they got through the mountain together. They didn't get to palaver with the man in black, but they ran down to the beach and they passed out on the beach. And does it happen this way? Or are they able to keep watch because there's 2 of them and one of them can stay awake and keep watch while the other sleeps, and vice versa? Like, would he be caught in this situation that cripples him had he saved Jake? And I don't think there's any clear answer to that question anywhere in this book, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, no, that did not occur to me, and that is something really interesting to think about. That he sort of is literally paying for his choice here.
Mm-hmm.
So you said you don't think that King wants us to hate Roland. I don't hate Roland right now. My main emotion about him is I want to learn why he did that, because I still see that as a mystery. Like, the question of why is the tower so important? Why is the tower so important that was the choice that he made? Because we know enough of his interiority to know that he's not a monster, but he did a monstrous thing.
Mm-hmm.
So why did he do that? And that is being kept from us. So
it is.
So that's where I am with the whole. I mean, I'm definitely a bit miffed with the guy, but fundamentally, sure. I just want to know what's up with this guy.
Yeah. And I think that's a great question to ask. What I like how King describes it as a cold dream. I think there's something so fascinating to that language there, right? Like, it's not like I didn't sacrifice him for this dream I had, for this desire I had. It's a cold dream. Like, it's not, there's no life to it. There's no warmth to it. There's no comfort in it. It's cold. I don't know. Like, I just think that's so specific.
I agree.
And I think part of that wording is you're seeing Roland like punish himself. Like, he's like, this wasn't even worth it. What was I thinking? And yet he still continues to act on it anyway. But I don't know. I just love that.
Yeah, me too.
All right. So speaking of getting punished physically, Roland is awoken from this dream by water. He's soaked. He's drowning in the dream, and he suddenly awakes to being soaked by water because a crashing wave has just hit him, and he realizes in horror that means wet guns, and more importantly, wet shells, which could be permanently ruined. And then he also sees, carried by the wave right next to him, a lobstrosity. It was about 4 feet long and about 4 yards to the right. It regarded Roland with black eyes on stalks. Its long, serrated beak dropped open, and it began to make a noise that was weirdly like human speech, plaintive, even desperate questions in an alien tongue. Didachik? Dumachum? Dadacham? Dedachek? So these are the lobstrosities, and I love them. I love them so much.
Yeah, the word lobstrosity is, I think, the first indication in this book that there's going to be some humor, maybe but quite a bit more humor than there was in the last book. I'll go ahead and say that, actually, because it's just a silly word. Like it's a kind of charming thing that's a bit of a surprise to hear come from the Roland, the grim Roland from the last book, right?
Yeah. And I mean, these things are so fascinating to me because so what happens here is this thing standing next to Roland. He tries to run away from it, but his legs are asleep because he's been asleep because he killed Jake. And so he has no one to wake him up. But he tries to drag himself away and he can't move. It catches up to him and with like astonishing quickness and incredible strength slices him open. It removes 2 fingers on his right hand. It slices into his calf and it cuts off his big toe. And the writing here is so wonderful. Like it is this thing that you're right is inherently silly. And the questions that like Dedachek, like it's so off-putting and weird. It's like it's almost nursery rhymish, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I audiobooked again, and now that I'm looking at the words in text, I'm like, oh, these are like sentences almost, but done in like a silly way. Yeah, that's pretty funny, actually.
Yeah, and so like he's trying to beat this thing off. He dramatically pulls his gun to shoot it, but he's pulled his gun with his right hand, and so he's missing the fingers that would hold the gun in place, so it just like falls out of his hand. And then when he eventually gets it in his left hand, it misfires because it got wet. He eventually manages to kill the lobster, bashing its head in with a rock, but the end result of this little misadventure is that he's wounded and a ton of his ammunition is ruined. And this is a big deal to me. I think when I first read this as a younger person, I gotta say I was mad. Like King takes, like we spent a whole book, 250 pages building up this guy, and he's a jerk. He sacrifices people again and again and again in monstrous ways. But on top, like besides that, he's like a badass gunslinger. Like he's a badass. He's this dual wielding badass cowboy, and then you strip him of that. Like it is his dominant hand, and the text does say at least that he's just as powerful a shot with his left as his right, but he's not going to be dual wielding these pistols anymore. He's lost half his ammunition. This isn't even like a big, giant, scary monster. It's a little lobster thing. Like any other situation, he would just shoot it and be done with it. I mean, this is the guy that killed an entire town's worth of people, and he's like basically laid bare and defeated by this silly lobster thing.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. It's not even that big, right? It's 4 feet long and kind of it just gets the jump on him. And I mean, that really kind of underlines what you said a bit ago about if he'd had somebody keeping watch, this just wouldn't have happened.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is one spot where I will compliment the audiobook reading experience because the audiobook reader just consistently uses this kind of mildly curious but weird cartoonish voice as he says all these lobstrosity lines. And then that switches to him just describing the thing, just brutally attacking him. And it's this wonderful juxtaposition of the really well written, sudden shocking violence with the cutesy gibberish lines. And, you know, to your point about being disappointed, like as a not so young reader, I was, I think, simultaneously disappointed and delighted that Roland is maimed here. Disappointed for the same reasons as you were, because, you know, King, you've harmed my badass self-insert character.
Yeah.
But also I'm excited that this guy who is called the Gunslinger, like more often than he's called Roland, just had half of his gunslinging taken away completely unceremoniously.
Yeah.
And in a story that thus far has been very much about tearing down this character and forcing him to do terrible things and give up metaphorical pieces of himself, I think now he's giving up physical pieces of himself. And it's fun that we're taking it in this direction, I think.
I agree. I totally agree. And as an adult that is able to separate myself from the wanting to be the self-insert character, I love it. I think it's such a daring and fascinating approach to this character. And I really do think, I think this is what kind of helps you maybe not like forgive Roland, but at least like pity him more than you had in the past, because this, I mean, like King is positioning him throughout at least these first 3 chapters as someone that's like entirely inept. Like he can barely walk. Like just the fact that you're missing a big toe on one of your feet, I mean, that is pretty important for like balance. Like he's probably not going to be able to run quite the same way anymore. He's just weakened incredibly. And not only is he weakened physically, but when we move on to the later chapters, when he's starting to deal with Eddie's world, he's weakened mentally because he's unable to understand any of the stuff going on. And so we're like systematically just tearing our character apart. And like, it's like, this is what you get. Like, this is what you wanted, Roland. This is what you sacrificed the kid for. Enjoy it.
To the point that we're even laughing at him a little bit in the latter parts. Yeah,
absolutely.
Which is very undignified for him.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to pull out that somewhere in here, he's like thirsty and injured, and he thinks water everywhere and not a drop to drink.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a direct quote snippet from the 1834 poem by Coleridge called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which at one point I knew a lot about and have since forgotten. But made me think, like, I can't exactly control F a book, but haven't there been albatross references at some point somewhere in the story? I might be wrong.
Possible. I honestly don't remember. I will write that down and we will look that up for next week.
Because albatross is another reference to Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So I thought maybe there was. If there's not, I'm just wrong. But this is definitely a reference to that poem. And this is a real poem from real Earth that he somehow knows and references.
Magically. Yeah. That's a good, I noticed that, but I didn't pull out the significance. So I'm glad you did.
Cool.
So that's where we leave Roland at the end of our prologue. So let's begin chapter 1, The Door. So we open this chapter with Roland again dreaming, not of the sailor this time, not of the sailor card, but of the prisoner, the first of the 3. And he awakes suddenly again, and this time instead of being savaged by a lobster, he is being attacked by a seagull, which has just landed on him, and he freaks out because he thinks it's a lobstrosity again. And I love, like, the opening of this section is really interesting to me because I love the way King describes his phantom pain here for his lost limbs. He says, "Go away," he told the absent parts of his body. "You are ghosts now. Go away." It helped a little. Not much, but a little. They were ghosts, all right, but lively ghosts.
Yeah, it's fun because it shouldn't help at all, right? So the fact that it does work implies that he's using his magical Roland powers to deal with phantom pain.
Sure.
But also, I think it's fun because if you invert that, it forces you to think of ghosts as phantom pain, like a ghost is an echo of an amputated person.
Sure.
This is a fun idea. And I also wanted to talk about prose and word choice.
Sure.
And I'm just going to read that again. It helped a little. Not much, but a little. They were ghosts, all right, but lively ghosts. Like, just listen to how that sounds read aloud. There's repetition, short sentences, it's a good cadence. And I think this is pretty consistently how Roland parts sound. King has a very specific way of writing the prose in the Roland sections, which makes it all the more jarring and noticeable, jarring in a good way when we switch to Eddie, who literally exists in a different prose style.
Yeah, that's a really, really good pull. I 100% agree with you. And I mean, looking at it's rhythmic. It's almost poem-like, like go away. There we have the repetition there, little and ghosts and ghosts.
Yeah.
It does seem like Roland is talking or thinking in verse almost.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with you that when we get to Eddie, we're going to spend some time talking about just how different the book sounds from his point of view. but I think this is really great to pull out because it is kind of slow, deliberate, repetitious. It is distinct, very, very much so. And I think the fun thing is you don't even really realize that until you switch point of view.
Yeah.
And it's not just like, this is not just the way King writes. This is the way King is writing the world through this character's eyes.
Right. Because we're going to get a page-long sentence in a little bit.
Yes.
So, yeah.
I and not to read into this too much, but I love like the idea of lively ghosts because we've already established that like Jake is haunting Roland a little bit, like what he did to Jake rather is haunting Roland. So he's experiencing phantom pain from the loss of his digits, but he's also experiencing some sort of ghost-like phantom pain from the loss of the boy. And I like that a lot.
Yeah, that's a good connection there. I like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Roland now has to assess the situation. He cleans his guns and he separates his shells into different piles into dry, possibly ruined, and definitely ruined. And now, after the assessment is done, he's low on ammo, he's super low on food, he's low on water, and he desperately, desperately needs to rest. But the more he rests, the lower those other things are going to get, and the more tired he's going to get. But hey, at least he's a lefty when it comes to jerking off, so still got that taken care of. Matt
will remember this. No, I for some reason I'm like, is that just a throwaway thing, or is it going to become plot relevant that he's a lefty for jerking off? Anyway. The element of the possibly ruined shells is just such a fun idea that I hope gets carried forward. Like having a gunslinger who doesn't know if his guns will work is a great idea for sustaining tension and uncertainty.
Yeah. I love the point of this where he's like, he loads up his gun with what he thinks is fresh rounds, and he like is super tempted to pull the trigger and find out, but he knows that every bullet is one less he'll have. I think he's down to like 30 something rounds he thinks will fire correctly. And it's just like maybe 10, maybe 5, maybe none. And yeah, he really wants to pull the trigger just to test one. He's like really tempted to do that, but holds off because they're so rare.
Yeah, I like that. It's just establishing kind of the level that he's sunk to, actually.
Yeah. So Roland realizes that the only path forward is forward, and I think he says something to the effect of like, if I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die on my feet walking towards the tower, not laying here, which is just, it's fascinating. And I love this little bit here where he's talking to himself, and I think there's some rhythmic, like poetic to moments to this as well. Very well, I am now a man with no food, with 2 less fingers and 1 less toe than I was born with. I am a gunslinger with shells which may not fire. I am sickening from a monster's bite and have no medicine. I have a day's water if I'm lucky. I may be able to walk perhaps a dozen miles if I pressed myself to the last extremity. I am, in short, a man on the edge of everything. That's like a poem.
Yeah. Yeah, it's epic and really is the fantasy tone, right? The big epic Lord of the Rings type of feeling that he's going for here.
Yeah, and as you said, the repetition, I am, I have, I may be. It's really good.
And the choices of stuff like press myself to the last extremity, like that's not a phrase that Eddie would ever think in his brain.
Yeah. And so he stubbornly walks north. He picks north. He's like, north or south? North feels right. So this is maybe some extrasensory perception here. And I think here we're kind of reminded of the gunslinger, or at least I was, as Roland trudges along the beach, barely alive. He falls down 3 times and is barely pulling himself forward. So like in the past few weeks, he's walked across the desert, through a cave, caught the man in black, got the information that he wanted, and yet we're back to him like trudging through the sand alone again.
Yeah, it's like we're starting this book in the same place as we started the last one, except now he's short 2 fingers and a toe.
Yep.
But he's closer to the tower, and that's all that matters to him.
Yep. I love that. It's like, I might die, but at least I'll die walking towards this thing. And I think you're right. The question that pops into your mind when you hear or read something like that is like, why? Like, what is it about this thing?
Yeah. I mean, like, again, whatever we expected to happen at the end of the last book certainly hasn't happened yet, because sure. I think, I did say that he would be somehow teleported to Earth. Instead, he just wakes up being eaten by lobstrosities. And I mean, this is more interesting than whatever I was imagining. But it keeps us in suspense because we're like, okay, where are we going? We don't know where we're going yet. And that's exciting.
Yeah. I think here we're also kind of starting to be reminded of the Oracle's prophecy a bit. Like the one thing the Oracle said to Roland last book was 3 is the number of your fate. We know he was told he's going to have to draw 3. And then we see here that he's fallen down 3 times. I also just want to point out that he lost 3 digits. Like he lost 2 fingers and a toe. Mm-hmm. So like, I think we're going to see the number 3 a lot in a book, which shouldn't be that surprising to you considering it's called Drawing of the 3. The thing I thought about here was that in the stages of the cross, the Catholic stages of the cross, Jesus falls down 3 times while bearing his cross to his crucifixion. And there's no textual connection here to that. But considering the number of biblical references we've had in the story so far, I think that is something of note, at least.
Sure. I think you're absolutely right. I wonder how many times... Never mind. I was going to say how many times does he fall down in Gunslinger? And I'm just like, I don't know, a bunch probably.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But on his 3rd fall, right when he's about to give up, Roland spots something in the distance and manages to summon some final strength and drag himself to it. It is a door. It stood 6.5 feet high and appeared to be made of solid ironwood, although the nearest ironwood tree must grow 700 miles or more from here. The doorknob looked as if it were made of gold, and it was filigreed with a design which the gunslinger finally recognized. It was the grinning face of the baboon. There was no keyhole in the knob, above it or below it. The door had hinges, but they were fastened to nothing. Written upon it in black letters 2/3 of the way up, written in the high speech, were 2 words: the prisoner. And so our delirious, dying gunslinger falls down 3 times and then looks up and sees, this time we don't see a way station. This time we see a magical door on the middle of the beach. And I think the thing we immediately have to ask ourselves is like, where did this come from?
Yeah.
Was this door sitting here always waiting for him? Did he summon it? Did his sacrifice of the 3 digits or his sacrifice of Jake, is this what summoned the door? Where did this come from?
It totally does remind me of when he falls in the desert, scuffs his hand, and then casts away his blood into the sand. Yeah. And then suddenly the way station is there.
Yeah.
Here he's injured himself again, and now it's not so suddenly, but he does fall down the 3rd time, and then bam, the door is there.
Yeah.
So I'm just now paying attention for times in the future when he either falls down or gets injured, and then he gets some kind of boon from the universe shortly thereafter.
Sure.
But yeah, so this is by far the most overtly magical thing to happen yet in this story. Like, yeah, a guy got brought back from the dead, sure, but like, this is a Narnia door inexplicably standing on a beach right where Roland happens to be heading.
Yeah.
And obviously it's meant for him specifically. Like everything about it is for him specifically, but how? Who put it here? Why? And why Eddie? And why this magic possession thing? What's the mechanism here? Like it really asks more questions than it answers for sure.
Absolutely. And you have to wonder, like you go back to the palaver with the man in black, and he says, this power is not granted to you. You've always had it. And it's like, what power? Is it the power to open the door? Is it the power to be able to step through it? Like, did he summon it? Can he open it? Like, which one of this thing is the power that Roland himself possesses? Because like, if a labstrosity gets an opposable thumb, can they open the door and walk through it? Like, do they even see it? Like, we don't have answers to any of these questions, but I think the book is asking them or forcing you to ask them. Yeah,
I think you're exactly right. Just I almost wonder if it's going to be something unexpected when he says this power. What do you mean exactly?
Mm-hmm. I don't know why. I really like the detail that the door still has hinges, but they aren't attached to anything.
Yeah.
Like I think when I imagine magic doors in my head, for whatever reason, I still put it in a frame. Like it's a door frame, right? And then you walk through the door frame. But this is not that. This is literally just a door. It's still got its hinges on it, but they're not attached to any kind of frame. There's no pivot point on which this door turns at all. I don't know why that detail is so delicious to me.
I just think that starts this theme that we're going to see throughout the rest of this section of precise, detailed description of crazy fantastical things, which is really fun. We'll talk about it more when he gets into the process of like testing the power, but it's like the part right here where he kind of like walks around the door, looks at it from the other side, and like pokes at it from different sides, and like basically he does a series of small experiments to test its properties, and it's very like methodical and calm and pragmatic, and if anything, it's the opposite of kind of what you expect in the big epic Lord of the Rings tone, because in Lord of the Rings tone, you don't poke and prod the magic. The magic is just a cool thing that's supposed to feel cool. To him, he's interacting with this thing like a physical object, and that makes it. I don't know. It is a fun idea to me. I agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all so delicious to me, and so now we get the moment where Roland says, "Okay, well, there's a door here. I'm gonna open it." So he does, and the first thing he sees is sky thousands of feet up, and he like freaks out and slams the door. And then we get this really wonderful moment where he like once again we go back into Roland's past, and he recalls the lessons of court, and this lesson here, his ability to like almost snapshot an image and then think about the details afterwards, which seems like a very useful power or not power rather, but just skill for someone to have.
Yeah, I love that this is the first scream of his adult life. That was great.
Yeah.
I love this idea. I kind of just have come to love at this point every single like court moment where he thinks back about some important lesson court gave him, and we're going to get more references to this idea that gunslingers can just they're just more aware than normal people. They're more present. I think that's a really cool idea.
Yeah. So he goes back and reviews that picture in his mind and realizes that he wasn't just looking at the sky. There was a white frame around it. He realizes it's a window, and we realize that he was looking into an airplane. And then quickly that it's actually the head of the prisoner. We're seeing through his eyes, and he looks at a magazine. He sees a car ad, which he calls a horseless carriage, and that links him to what Roland. Links Roland to his memory of what Jake told him about the world he came from. And I think this is like King kind of priming us to understand that Jake's world and Eddie's world is our world, and that they're both from the same place.
Yeah, I don't think King is trying to make this mysterious. I think he's being very clear, like, yeah, it's Earth. It's your Earth. Yeah. I almost wish I'd written down some predictions for what would lie through the door, just so that we could read them and laugh at me. Because inside the head of a drug smuggler on a plane would not have been on that list.
Right. Yeah.
It's just delightful.
It's been so long since the first time I read this book that I cannot for the life of me remember what I expected. But there's no doubt in my mind it was not this at all.
Yeah.
So the chapter ends, and it's time to meet Eddie Dean. So we move on to chapter 2, titled Eddie Dean. We start the chapter with Roland still watching the events through the prisoner's eyes as he gets up and suddenly rushes to the plane bathroom to puke. Eddie is sick, and as Roland slowly figures it out, he's sick with what was called the heroin, which he relates to devil grass. I think some of the most fun of this chapter and this section in general is seeing Roland watch things that we understand, but he does not. I think King like plays with that a little bit here. Like he toes the line between this is absurd and ridiculous and, oh, that's just a bathroom.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of delightful fish out of water type humor throughout this chapter.
Yeah.
Also, this is just so 80s. It's just overwhelmingly a book published in 1987. It's actually quite funny. But, it's also fun to watch Roland puzzle out the situation that he's in, because he's thinking through it very methodically. We do recognize what's going on before he does, but that somehow just makes it more fun to watch him figure it out.
Yeah, and I think it shows like a remarkable aptitude, right? Because like imagine if you like walking along, like you walking your dog and then you find this door and then you open the door and like you're seeing into the head of some guy on a spaceship, and like are you just going to be like, oh, well, of course, this is I'm seeing through this guy's eyes. This is obvious. This is some world. It's obviously a world where that other, like, he just like jumps. It's not he's jumping to conclusion, but he connects dots remarkably quickly and calmly, considering the insanity of what's happening here.
Yeah, we've kind of made fun of him for being dumb in the past, and that was sort of joking, right? And I think here's where it becomes clear that it's not really the right word for him, right? His I think, like, the fact that he takes this all in stride does kind of speak to his incuriousness or whatever, but like he's clearly not unintelligent. He solves the situation, right? The whole rest of the section from here on is him cleverly solving this problem for Eddie, basically. And he comes out of it looking pretty. I mean, at first he's kind of, it's like, haha, he doesn't know what he's doing, fish out of water, and then he rapidly figures it out and saves the day.
100%. Yeah, so it is weird. Like, it's kind of infantilizing Roland a bit, but also he shows exactly why he's such a badass still. And not using guns or not using his physical prowess, but just using his problem solving. Yeah. So we get this cool moment where Eddie looks into the mirror of the bathroom, and therefore Roland gets to see what he looks like for the first time. And he immediately sees a face he had seen once before on a tarot card. The same dark eyes and spill of dark hair. The face was calm but pale, and in the eyes through which he now saw reflected back at him, Roland saw some of the dread and horror that the baboon-ridden creature on the tarot card. I just thought that was really cool. Like, of course, it's not only that the tarot card like symbolizes Eddie, but the tarot card was literally Eddie Dean. I thought that was a cool beat.
It is. Yeah, it just feels cool. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And we also get the first establishing moment here of his eyes and the importance of eyes, because that is going to be something that carries us through this week's reading for sure, is the difference in the eye color and just like the not even the color. There's like, I mean, like it's the eyes are the window to the soul, right? So it's this measure of who these people are and comparison via their eyes.
Yeah, the eyes is yet another thing where in a different kind of fantasy story that would just be like a neat touch, a neat flourish, and in this one the eye color thing becomes this extremely practical, pragmatic detail that matters to the actual plot. And
I think that's like, when I think about the way King writes, that feels like a very Stephen King thing to me, because I think like he is not a planner, right? He is not the type of writer that sits down and outlines his books. He's a pantser. He puts his characters in situations and then he like develops ways to get out of them. And so like this idea that you're putting these characters in this situation and you're like, okay, how do we create conflict out of this situation? What do we do? And it's like, well, if Roland is looking through if Roland becomes Eddie, what if his eyes change? And then it's like, ooh, I like that. And then he goes, okay, well, what would that mean though? Well, what if someone notices the difference in the eye color? And they just like goes down that path. And that just feels like a very Stephen King way of managing plot to me.
Yeah. That makes as much sense to me as it can without having that much familiarity with him. Sure.
Sure. So here at the end of this section, I just wanted to read this because I think this is like classic Roland, and I just love the writing. Without thought, with the simple resolve that had made him the last of them all, the last to continue marching on and on long after Cuthbert and the others had died or given up, committed suicide or treachery, or simply recanted the whole idea of the tower. With the single-minded and incurious resolve that had driven him across the desert and all the years before the desert in the wake of the man in black, the gunslinger stepped through the doorway. God, I love that so much.
Yeah, it's a long series of clauses separated by semicolons, so it is a longer sentence, but it has that cadence to it still. It sounds beautiful to be read aloud, right? I agree. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
I do think like, well, no, go ahead, because I think you're going to talk about what I want to say.
Sure. Yeah. So you know, we're with Roland. He's like, there's a door here. Guess I'll step through it. Right. We've established him as a guy who will always step through a door if he thinks that it's on the path of his quest. Roland rushes in, basically. Also, I'm not sure if this is the first reference to others in his past. but it is interesting regardless. At some point, Roland was on this Grail quest. Tower quest, and with like a little party of adventurers. And now he's the last one. And King keeps dropping hints about like this about the past. And this is just the kind of thing that makes me suspect we'll eventually learn more about who these people were.
Yeah, to my knowledge, it is the first time that we've understood that this quest for the tower is one that he was not undertaking by himself. And we know who Cuthbert is. Like, we've had Cuthbert, and I think the choice to bring up Cuthbert here when we're going to very soon compare him directly to Eddie Dean, I think is really important. But I love, like, the others had died or given up, committed suicide or treachery, or simply recanted. Like, I love that. Like you imagine you're like out with your fellowship, right? And people are dying. People are saying, I don't want to do this anymore. People are killing themselves rather than go forward on this. People are betraying you. Like, this is like a long line of people that have either been killed themselves, or just given up and walked away.
I know the more I think about it, the more kind of radically important it seems, right? It's like, this is not Frodo at the beginning of his journey. This is Frodo after, like, every member of the Fellowship is dead in his wake, and he's the last one, and he still doesn't know where Mount Doom is. Like, like, it's such a differently oriented story.
Yeah, except also we don't know why getting to Mount Doom is so important. Like,
exactly.
We haven't been told there's a ring he needs to toss in it yet.
Yeah, he's just going there. Yeah, we'll see. It's not important.
No, not important at all. Yeah. All right, so Roland jumps into Eddie's head for the first time, and we start a series of point of view shifts. Here we switched. I like, as he walks into Eddie, the book switches to Eddie's point of view, which I think is a fun thing. And we quickly find out that Eddie is a junkie and is smuggling some cocaine in his armpits at the behest of his older brother, Henry.
Yeah. It's funny because at first I was like, good old big brother Henry. And then as the story goes on, I kind of realized what a huge piece of shit Henry is. Mm-hmm. And I kind of wanted to kick his teeth in. And
sure.
What's interesting is I then reread the section entirely again today prior to the podcast, and I no longer had that feeling. So now I'm wondering why I hated Henry entirely so much. But anyway, that's just a weird kind of glitch in my brain where I was like, I went from like, oh, Henry sounds nice, to like, oh, I hate Henry, to like, why did I hate Henry?
Well, so, I think you're matching Eddie's feelings about his brother. I think he loves his brother and he hates his brother. I mean, he's here because of Henry. This is why he's doing this. And like, he's compared to Lucy and Charlie Brown in the football, right? So yeah. I don't know. I think that's a very normal reaction to Henry.
Like, he thinks about his brother abusing him basically, and also taking care of him. Yeah. And like, they have this sister who died, which seems very important, and like his brother is very protective of him for some reason relating to this, and it all just seems very complicated in a way where I kind of desperately want to meet this Henry person.
Yeah. So we see here, as we jump into Eddie's head, that the pace, rhythm, and tone of King's writing like really, really dramatically shifts here. Eddie is a heroin junkie and he's frantic. His mind is moving a mile a minute as he one of the first things we do is hit him do this like super fast-paced description of the difference between cold turkey and cool turkey, as he runs over Henry's plan to get the cocaine into the United States. And I think this is an area to me where Stephen King really shines as a writer, and the Stephen King that I really, really love. This writing style is like King. Like, Eddie's thoughts move and breathe and feel alive. It's like, it's such a perfect encapsulation of psyche. Like, this feels like the head of a frantic person who's like both nervous and suffering from withdrawal and just kind of a little bit nuts.
Yeah, it's super amazing. Like for one thing, this kind of introduction to him is done mostly with this giant sentence.
Yeah.
But it still works. It still flows. Like, it still has a beautiful cadence when read aloud, though it's a completely different kind of cadence and different kind of feeling and like velocity and style from Roland's narration. Like Roland's, it almost feels like a horse that's taking a slow methodical trot through a desert, and
Sure.
this guy is just like on coke surfing on a giant wave or something.
Yeah.
And the way he, the way he thinks is so rich with imagery and little touches of personality, like the dogs with the PhD noses and like, oh, did you always sweat like that when the air conditioning's too high, Mr. Dean? And like humor and sardonic wit, and just how he thinks in general.
Yeah. I don't want to read this whole thing because it's very long, but I do want to read a little bit of it.
Sure.
Just because, like, to let the listeners hear this when they're thinking about this. Like, it starts, "Hey, Henry, oh great sage and eminent junkie big brother, while we're on the subject of our feathered friends, you want to hear my definition of cooked goose? That's when the customs guy at Kennedy decides there's something a little funny about the way you look. Or it's one of those days where they got those dogs with the PhD noses out there instead of a port authority, and they all start to bark and pee all over the floor, and it's you they're all just about strangling themselves on their choke chains to try to get to. And after the customs guys toss all your luggage, they take you into a little room and ask you if you don't mind taking off your shirt, and you say, yeah, I sure would. I'd mind like hell. I'd pick up a little cold down in the Bahamas, and the air conditioning in here is really high, and I'm afraid I might turn into pneumonia. And they say, oh, is that so? And it's just like, it carries on from there, like, and it's just frenetic, and you're right, like, it jumps into these very specific descriptions. I love the PhD noses. I love the end of it here when he says, unless they're what you might call tumors on the corpus of society. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Those things that look like a couple baggies held there with strapping tape. And by the way, don't worry about that smell, son. That's just goose. It's cooked. It's just like, it's so alive. Like, it's so alive. There's really, I don't see a lot like this.
Yeah. I expect we'll talk about this kind of thing a lot, because I think this is something King is good at. But like, I was reflecting on this quite a bit. This idea that, just the way that we as a society have decided to portray the writing of the human inner voice is kind of a weird anomaly, right? Because the typical book kind of imposes really what is really a very artificial level of structuredness onto human thinking. And this is one of the ways that I think King is a genius, is the free flowing, non-linear, tangential, discursive nature of actual human thought. That's a lot closer to the way Eddie Dean actually thinks. And and I get that King is trying to portray him as being coked out, basically, or not coked out, but freaking out, I should say. But also, like, King just does sort of take a deeper slice into what human thought really is like, and manages to convey that to the page better than I think most writers do.
Totally agree. I think my favorite hypothesis of yours is that the best writers are, like, also good, know a lot about psychology. Just that they understand the human mind in a way that not so good writers don't. And I think King is one of those writers. Absolutely.
Yeah. Just either know a lot about psychology, or just have a sort of naturalistic insight into human psychology that serves the same purpose, more or less.
Sure. Yeah. I don't think I literally meant like he's reading Psych 101 books or anything like that.
I mean, he might be. Like, I wouldn't put it past a person who's curious about people. For all I know, they do read books about psychology, but mainly it's an insight into human nature, I think.
Yeah. And one of the things I want to think about with Eddie Dean, I mean, King writes about addiction a lot, because it's something that, especially in this part of his career, he was suffering with. And it's so interesting to me because I think, like, even before King, like, maybe even consciously acknowledged his addiction issues, he was writing about characters suffering from addiction. So it's like there's almost maybe not subtextual, but like you're aware of stuff that you don't want to label yourself that, so you instead create characters to wrestle with that idea. I think Eddie Dean like is one of those. I don't want to call him a king insert, because I certainly don't think that's the case, but I do think he's a way in which we can explore the concept of addiction. I mean, like the image of Eddie Dean, the thing we were defined with before we even knew him, was that he is suffering from a heroin addiction. So that, at least at this juncture in the story, seems to be one of like the most important things we're going to have to deal with this character. I mean, it's not an accident that he's someone suffering from addiction that is also like involved in the drug trade. Like, so I don't know. Like, I think I don't want to do this too much, because I don't want to make these books like all about all about the author entirely, but there's definitely something to that. Like, there's a choice that was made here to paint this character this way.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of those instances where it's okay to talk about that for a minute.
Sure.
I mean, I've noticed it, like for myself, that several times I've like looked back on characters that I've created in writing and been like, oh, that's just the problem that I was struggling with in my life at the time, put into character form. And it didn't even necessarily do that on purpose. It was just like what was on my mind. So I can kind of buy that. That's it's not that King is like crying for help via this character. It's more like this is on his mind. This is what he's thinking about a lot, and so it's natural for this to be a character that he writes. This is kind of the space that he's in anyway.
Yeah. I just really wanted to talk about The Shining there, but I'm not allowed to do that because you haven't read that book.
Yeah, you should just stop, I'll plug my ears, and would that be good? Would that be good audio?
No, not at all.
Okay, never mind.
One day we'll talk about those books. Anyway, let's move on here, because as Eddie is looking into the mirror, he suddenly gets this really strong urge that he's being watched, or not urge, this feeling that he's being watched, and we see that his green eyes have been replaced by Roland's icy blue ones. This physical change, as we mentioned, is going to end up being super plot relevant, but for now I think it's just like a cool effect of not just showing Roland's presence, but kind of like binding the characters together in a way. Like, Eddie is looking through the mirror and he sees Roland. Like, these characters are now bound together in that way. And I just love, Matt, I love how King describes Roland's eyes through Eddie looking at him. Not hazel, but a blue color of fading Levi's. Eyes that were chilly, precise, unexpected marvels of calibration. Bombardier's eyes.
Bombardier's eyes. Jesus. I mean, even if you don't like Roland right now, he's just kind of awesome. He's just this awesome, fantastical being. And this whole idea that there's this physical sign of the magical possession is used in just such a practical, cool way.
Yeah. I think it's so like, this is King taking advantage of the fact that he's finally able to jump into another point of view. I think if we look back on the Gunslinger, one of the most interesting choices there in my mind is the choice to never remove from, like, we could have jumped into Jake's point of view at some point, but we really never do. He locks us with the Gunslinger in that book. And now here we have Eddie Dean, this different character. And one of the first things we do when he's introduced is we jump into his point of view. And then we get to look at Roland from the perspective of someone else, which we've never really gotten to do completely.
Yeah, I guess we briefly do the flashback. But
that's a little different though.
I think that is a little different, and it's very short too. And as you say, we're not actually getting any kind of perspective on Roland. Textually, that's just a story being relayed. True.
So,
it's basically Roland internalizing the story. So yeah. I think you're right.
So we cut back to Roland's point of view at this point, and we're doing this thing now that I think King does really cleverly structurally here, where we kind of, every time we jump point of view at this point, we're kind of jumping a few moments back in time. So like, we have this whole Eddie part where he like looks into the mirror and sees someone else, and like then he hears a thought in his head and like freaks out about it, and then we cut back to Roland, and it's like moments before that. And it kind of allows us to recontextualize the scene from the other person's point of view. And it's something that King like employs throughout the rest of the chapter, I think. And and Roland uses it here to realize that when he's in Eddie, he feels everything that Eddie feels. Like he feels the withdrawal that he's feeling. He feels the shakiness, and his own weaknesses have gone away. The blood poisoning, the numbness of his fingers have gone away from him. Although we see a little bit later that Eddie feels that feeling, which is really weird. Like the connection there is really interesting.
Yeah, that's cool.
And then Roland starts testing stuff out, and he momentarily takes control of Eddie. He walks forward, which is a fascinating idea, because what does that mean? And I love how the text acknowledges that doesn't have specific meaning, but it's like I think there are times when King doesn't want to get into a lot of detail about the weird crazy shit, and it's just he walked forward. He didn't know what that meant, but that's the best way he could describe it.
Right.
And he just says, does that, and then just moves on because it's not important. But
sure.
He walks forward, he takes control, and he uses that control to turn around behind him and see that the door is still there, that Roland's body is there lying down defenseless on the sand, just hanging out. I think that's a really fun detail, that it's not like his body has transplanted itself into Eddie. It's just his soul has, or consciousness has.
And he can see the door, and Eddie can see the door later. It's also practical. It's like if the kids discovered the door in Narnia, and then they immediately start using it to smuggle some drugs under Aslan's nose. I'm really digging the vibe of Magic Narnia door, but also Goodfellas. It's just it's great fun is what it is. And once again, we're setting all these things up because we're going to use them shortly in a practical way.
Yeah. 100%. So Eddie goes back to his seat, and just I love that Eddie is every time Roland does this, Eddie blacks out, and he just at first he's just well, that's weird. But then it keeps happening, and he starts getting increasingly more freaked out about it. But back in his seat, Roland comes forward again because he realizes that the himself that's sitting on the beach needs food, and so he orders some food from the flight attendant. She gives him a tuna fish sandwich, or what Roland describes as a Tooter Fish Popkin. I love this so much. We've talked about this already, but this is another one of those ways in which we're taking this assured, capable, powerful man with bombardier's eyes and almost infantilizing him in the silliness of his fish out of water interaction with this world.
Yeah. So this podcast is now the Tooter Fish Popcast. By the way, I Googled that. There's not already a Tooter Fish Popcast. So, so yes, in a fish out of water story, a lot of the humor is going to come from the character looking silly, and the book just dives in with this, right? Tooter is a silly word. Popkin is a silly word. And you just imagine King just sitting there cackling as he types this.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because Popkin is a silly word, but that is the word for sandwich in Roland's world. Tooter fish is just him mishearing something, but Popkin is just what they call it. And I think that's such, you have to wonder. I think you're absolutely right that you can almost imagine King making this connection and being all right, so he calls it a popkin, and we have tuna fish, and he's oh, tuna fish. Oh, wait a minute.
Tooter fish, yeah.
Tooter. Because it sounds like a fart, and that's funny to me.
Yeah, I mean exactly, right? He's definitely, definitely doing it on purpose. He's making Roland seem silly and foolish on purpose here.
Yeah. But we then cut back to Eddie Dean, and Eddie is kind of laying in his seat, and he's about to go to sleep, and we get this cool flashback. But before we do that, we have another bit where he starts thinking about his brother Henry, which is a thing that he's going to think about a lot, because it seems like Henry is the most important relationship in his life. And we have here where it says, the trouble with him and Henry was they were like Charlie Brown and Lucy. The only difference was once in a while Henry would hold the football so Eddie could kick it. Not often, but once in a while. Eddie had even thought, while in one of his heroin dazes, that he ought to write Charles Schultz a letter. Dear Mr. Schultz, he would say, you're missing a bet by always having Lucy pull the football up at the last second. She ought to hold it down there once in a while. Nothing Charlie Brown could ever predict, you understand. Sometimes she'd maybe hold it down for him to kick 3, even 4 times in a row, then nothing for a month, then once, and then nothing for 3 or 4 days, and then, you get the idea. That would really fuck the kid up, wouldn't it? Eddie knew it would really fuck the kid up. From experience. he knew it.
Sometimes a writer is really good because they're good at stringing together words, and sometimes they're really good because they're a fountain of clever and original thoughts.
Yeah.
And King is both of those things.
And it's so fascinating to me because like the Charlie Brown and Lucy like pulling up the football thing has just become almost memeified in our culture. Like it's just an image for fucking with someone now. And yet King takes it and does something original with it. Like, yeah, we always talk about this image, but you know what would really be mean if you just make it inconsistent.
Right. And what's cool is like this is simultaneously funny, but also like chilling. Like it builds up this relationship with Henry as this deeply toxic thing, but does it using this lighthearted comparison to Charlie Brown. And like, it goes from being funny to being a bit uncomfortable when he's like, from experience, he knew it.
Yeah.
It's great.
It's one of those like, it's like an absurd story. Cause like the heroine days, like writing a letter to Charles Schultz and being like, hey, you ever thought about this? Here's how I can fix your comic, is like a silly thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has this like, and I think as we'll see, that's kind of Eddie Dean, where he like deals with this super serious darkness with this kind of sarcastic humor. That's kind of establishing this, I think, really important part of his character.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So Eddie falls asleep and he dreams, and what he dreams about are the moments before he got on the plane and the interaction he had with the drug dealer down in Nassau. This, Matt, is almost entirely a tangent. Like, it doesn't matter to the ongoing plot, but it does one really important thing. It establishes Eddie as a person with what King describes as deep steel. He's a junkie, sure, and he has all the weaknesses that come along with being a junkie. But underneath that addiction and the franticness in his mind, there is some real strength in Eddie Dean. He's smart. He researches things. Like we see the story about like he knows why heroin scientifically works on him. He like knows that if you paralyze someone, the addiction will go away because he knows exactly the spot on your body that addiction comes from. He knows the difference between the poison shit and the good shit, and we see him handle this jerk down in Nassau like perfectly, where a less strong person would have completely futzed it up. Eddie handles it perfectly. And I think most importantly, Roland sees this too, because we learn later that this dream that Eddie is having, this memory that Eddie is having, by being in him, Roland has access to this. Yeah,
I think one of my favorite parts of this dream is when he smiles and the smile like freaks the guy out. And it reminds me so much of Roland's horrible smile as he goes to his test. I wonder if that's an intentional connection or not. But I love it either way.
Yeah.
So Roland is this cool gunslinger who we're kind of gradually made to dislike in the first book, and Eddie is this drug smuggling lowlife who we're quickly shown is resourceful and no pushover and tough. And like the detailed and methodical nature of his thoughts and actions actually makes him seem pretty competent and likable. So I'm just kind of tracking how King is playing with how much we like or dislike these characters.
Yeah, I agree. I think you would think the cowboy would be the character you would love and the junkie would be the character you're just annoyed with. But somehow it's the opposite.
Yeah.
And in this moment, while the gunslinger is kind of witnessing the scene, he notes to himself that he sees in Eddie his old friend. He sees Cuthbert. And the text here says he achingly reminds Roland of his long dead friend. Like, achingly. Like, he's so similar to him that it hurts him to think about that. And I find that really, really fascinating.
And wasn't it specifically like his like combination of like weakness and potential that reminds him of Cuthbert? Or that was my impression anyway.
I think so. And like we know Cuthbert is kind of this like fast talking, smooth guy that always had a smile on his face. And that's kind of what we see from Eddie here. At least a little bit.
Yeah, because it wasn't just like, oh, he looks like Cuthbert. It was personality.
It's absolutely. I don't know if we've seen Cuthbert described, so I don't know if it is even looks. I think it is just the way he holds himself, the way he comports himself, like just who he is as a person reminds him of Cuthbert.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just wondering if that implies that his similarity to Cuthbert has anything to do with like why he was drawn, or I'm assuming that Eddie has been drawn, whatever drawn means, and like because like why Eddie is one of the big questions, right?
Sure.
Why this connection? It's a complete mystery. There's not even a hint at this point. The closest thing to a hint would be, oh, he's kind of like Roland's dear friend Cuthbert. So
sure, yeah. And I think it is a mystery, but I think this section, that deep steel that exists here, maybe shows some like there's power to this guy.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So we hop point of view again, but this time not to Eddie, not to Roland, but over to Jane, our flight attendant, delivering Eddie/Roland his Tooter Fish. And Jane happens to be a very observant flight attendant, and she notices that Eddie's eyes have magically changed from his kind of attractive hazel ones to Roland's iceberg blue. And then, of course, when he gets the sandwich, he utters in high speech, "Thank you, Sai." And then she's like, "What's this? What's this?"
That's
some kind of foreign language.
Yeah.
And she starts to get really suspicious, and now Eddie is being watched.
I love Jane. I wouldn't be surprised if we never see Jane again, but I would be happy if we did. Jane yet again has a somewhat different mode of internal narration too, even from Eddie. And again, like once again, this fixation on the practical consequences of the eye colors and oh, is he changing out his contacts? What's going on here?
Yeah.
It's very fun.
Well, and again, like King like dives into this character like 100%. Like we define her a little bit. Like she's thinking about back in training, and like we just flesh out this tiny little bit character a lot more than you would think an author would do for this role that is just, I am going to be suspicious. I am the instigator of the conflict that Roland and Eddie are going to have to find a way to solve together. But we flesh her out. Like we understand her. Like I love the moment where she like steals herself and grabs the coffee thermos and loosens it, like prepared to toss it on him if he makes any move. It's just like totally unnecessary, but I think breathes life into the book a little bit.
Sure, and it's also cranking up the tension of this whole plane flight has just been an exercise in like Roland and us realizing how bad this situation is and things getting worse and worse. So yeah.
So Roland now has to perform a test, and he successfully finds that he can bring things out of Eddie's world and into his own through the door. And he smuggles the Tooter Fish over to his body, his dying body, who scarfs it down immediately. And turns out it's a pretty good popkin.
Yeah. And I think this is cool. This is the first unambiguous victory in the story.
Yeah.
That everything has looked pretty bleak up until this point for Roland and kind of for Eddie too. Roland's falling apart. Eddie isn't doing so hot either. And now we see that there are some very useful possibilities here.
Yeah. I love that King also takes the time to describe what it looks like when you're taking something through the door, in that it literally just disappears from the hands of the person that was holding it in Eddie's world. And the detail that he's holding it in his hand that doesn't have fingers. And so when he brings it over, it falls out of his hand.
Yeah.
Because he's holding it with the fingers that don't exist. Like, that's just fun detail that didn't need to be in there, but it really helps define the difference and kind of explains in a not very scientifically but very like character driven way how this process works.
Right. I mean, it almost at this point it's almost completely stripped away like the mystique of this magical Narnia door. It's just like we're boiling it down to, all right, let's get down to the brass tacks. What are the exact functional details of this thing so that we can use it?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's one thing King does very well. I think he introduces these fantastical elements, but and like lulls you into them slowly, but he eventually does kind of narrow it down to a thing that you understand. Like you get to a point where you understand the rules, even if they're like loosely defined, they're still the rules of this thing. Yeah.
I mean, I remember from Carrie, at least, like the way her power develops over the story felt very like mechanical and logical.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to our final chapter of the week. Let's talk about chapter 3, Contact and Landing. We open this chapter with Eddie waking back up from his nap just as the plane starts to make its final descent. He heads back into the bathroom to take a hit of heroin because he saved some heroin because it turns out Cool Turkey is not that actually.
Yeah, not working for him.
Yeah, but on his way back, he bumps into Jane, our flight attendant, again, and unfortunately, she sees his eyes again and sees that they've now switched back to Hazel. And this, combined with Eddie's general weirdness, means Jane is basically on red alert now and has decided that he's 100% a terrorist. And it's so funny to me because this is, like, you were talking about how this book is so 1987, and this is a part that is absolutely that. Like, her response to seeing a terrorist is like, oh, he's going to, like, try to charge the cockpit and make the plane fly to where he wants to go, which is just like no one in 2020 would make that assumption with terrorism in a plane anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just so fascinatingly dated now. It's crazy.
It's funny because nowadays I don't even think people remember that there was this rash of plane hijackings back in those times.
Yeah.
It was just a almost normal thing. In fact, it was to the point where, like, if it were to happen, you would just, like, the smart thing to do would just be keep your head down because everything's probably going to be okay. You're just going to be delayed.
Yeah. I mean, I think when 9/11 happened, not to get really dour with this podcast, but when 9/11 happened, that's kind of why, because the standard, if a terrorist got control of the plane, like, you're normally just gonna be like, all right, they're gonna, like, fly us over to somewhere else and we're gonna land there and have to park there for a while until this whole thing gets sorted out. Like, that was just what happened when hijackings occurred.
Yeah. And now we have, like, steel doors on the cockpit. So
yeah. I also think, like, the fact that it's a white guy in 2020, you would definitely not use the word terrorist. Probably, they probably would have honestly just gone, "Oh, he's clearly a junkie."
Yeah, or just like him saying foreign words. It's like, oh, I guess he's just foreign. Like that's the thing that happens a lot. So
yeah,
but yeah, that I mean, so much about her point of view in particular just struck me as quintessentially 80s.
Yeah, and it's new to this book, right? Like, or the series rather, because the entire last series was this, like, weird Western world with some fantasy elements in it, some biblical elements in it, and now we've, like, this feels like a book that takes place in 1987.
Yeah. So her fixation with this idea that he's just going to pull an Uzi out and, like, hijack the plane. I don't know. I felt like I time traveled. But plot wise, the book at this point is rapidly making things worse for our characters while simultaneously subtly giving them the tools to save themselves. And I think that the way King does this, just kind of ratcheting everything up, it just makes the writing really electric and really propulsive.
Yeah, I agree.
Just a random thought as we were going through this, I was like, oh, I wonder if Roland will at any point learn that the word for this airship that he is in is plane, and think about the Rain in Spain rhyme.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't think about that. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think maybe that's why we're, like, avoiding that word, because he's just been calling it a sky carriage up until this point, and nobody has said airplane or plane at all. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like I'm saying this is a plot hole, you know.
No.
It would be fun if he thought about this.
It would be it would be a fun moment of huh.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but the point now that we see is that Roland has noticed Jane noticing Eddie, and we get this great line here. The gunslinger thought this man, prisoner or not, was probably better at the fine art of survival than any of the other men he had seen on the air carriage. The others were fat things, for the most part, and even those who looked reasonably fit also looked open, unguarded. Their faces, those of spoiled and cosseted children, the faces of men who would fight eventually, but who would whine almost endlessly before they did. You could let their guts out onto their shoes, and their last expression would not be rage or agony, but stupid surprise. The prisoner was better, but not good enough. Not at all. I don't know why. The cosseted children, man. It's great. It's so fun to take this character who we've established as being this, you know, guy with cold bombardier's eyes and just have him judge these cosseted children, which is just like us, basically. He's talking about us. It's totally my jam. I want to talk about something else here too, sure.
Which is that lots of stories that we read and do shows on have pretty competent protagonists. And if a protagonist seems too competent, whatever that means, then there are a lot of readers who will sort of turn on them. Because we really need our characters to have flaws for various psychological reasons. So I think in this situation, Roland's flaw is unfamiliarity with the situation and frequent comedy beats at his expense, reminding us how out of place he is. And I think that all kind of puts us more on his side and then makes it more satisfying when he's able to solve the problem despite the obstacles.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it does a very good job to establish this problem, and it doesn't feel like the world is bending around Roland to allow him to solve this problem. It's just like a natural like cause and effect realization chain, while also showing how like inept he is at understanding the rules of this world. Like he has his skills, and his skills get him just far enough to solve the problem without really understanding what's going on. Because here like he kind of puts things together. And the one thing we haven't given Roland in this yet is like a goal, because so he walks upon this door and he's in Eddie's head, but we still don't know what drawing means. We don't know what he's supposed to do with Eddie. So King hasn't given him a goal yet, really. But in this moment, as the plane is getting ready to get to the gate, Roland makes a connection. The thing that he needs is medicine. He needs antibiotics. His arm, his fingers are infected, and if he does not get antibiotics, he is going to die.
Yeah.
And he recognizes that now that he knows he can take stuff from this world, that if he can find medicine in this world, he'll be okay. But he also knows the ritual of clearing the customs is something that Eddie will not pass because he's got the drugs up his armpits and Jane has noticed him. So suddenly we've like very cleverly given our protagonist a understandable, clear goal that isn't like, we haven't solved the mystery of why Eddie, what is drawing. We haven't solved any of that mystery. We've just given him like a secondary, or rather a primary, like immediate goal. And it just happens to also need this character that we've introduced that is going to be one of the three, whatever that means.
Yeah. It's so well done, right? It's so well crafted and intricate. I really like it.
Yeah.
But Scott, something more important. Be honest with me. Do you always refer to the clearing of the customs when you go on international flights? Because I mean, I'm obviously going to from now on. Yeah.
I mean, here's the thing is nobody in my life gets that when I say it. I've definitely said it before, but nobody understands it.
Surely you've flown with your dad.
Yeah, but okay. My dad has decided he hates Stephen King. So every time I bring up Stephen King with my father, we get in arguments about it. So I've just stopped doing it now.
Oh, no. Well, yeah. I'll talk about the clearing of the customs with you, Scott.
The next time we fly on an international flight together, I will turn to you and say, Matt, it is time for the ritual of the clearing of the customs.
It's a deal. All right.
Present your documents to the oracle.
But yeah, so like, kind of like you were saying, it's really elegant how King has created the situation where Roland really doesn't care about Eddie. Yeah. But like he doesn't really care what happens to Eddie, but he decides like, oh, okay, I need to save him so that I can save myself.
Right. And I think there would be something inherently unsatisfying with Roland just going, well, clearly this is one of the three, and therefore I clearly need to save them. I think that like you can get there eventually, but you have to build up to that in some sort of like real, like organic way.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're doing here. Like it's self-interest first, and then maybe once immediate crisis is solved, then we can start talking about, all right, so this drawing thing.
Right. This does not feel like, and then the plot said that Roland needed to save Eddie. This is very self-interested, actually, which is very much in keeping with what we know of Roland. So.
It sure is. So I really like this line here. The answer was so large and simple, so close to him, that he very nearly did not see it at all. It was the drug the prisoner meant to smuggle in that would make the clearing the customs so difficult, of course. There must be some sort of oracle who might be consulting in the case of people who seem suspicious. Otherwise, Roland gleaned, the clearing ceremony would be simplicity itself, a crossing a friendly border. As crossing a friendly border was in his own world, one made the sign of fealty to the kingdom's monarch, a simple token gesture, and was allowed to pass. Like, I just think, like, it's just like a fun exercise of saying, okay, what would customs look like to a person from this world? What would that look like? How would you describe that in a realistic way? And then King writes it. It's not. I think this is maybe one of those things that's deceptively more difficult than you think it is, because like if it gets too gimmicky, it's just silly to the point of like world breaking. But I don't know. Like, I think this is totally believable. Like, it's like, oh yeah, it's just like when you enter another land. Like, I've done that before. You just got a simple token gesture, but they might have some sort of oracle that's making sure you're not doing anything suspicious.
Yeah. It's exactly crossing a border is exactly what he's doing. It's just it shows that Roland is actually pretty clever, that he's able to make this connection, and he's right. I mean, he's using a silly framework for it, or an unusual framework, but he's correct fundamentally. So
yeah. And then after Roland realizes this, he of course realizes the obvious, that he can simply take those drugs into his world and then give them back to Eddie once he's cleared the customs. Roland decides to test this fact by using a coin in Eddie's pocket to confirm that if something's brought over to his world, it can be taken back. It works, but he also performs a secondary test, because he's very clever, as you said, where he grabs a shell from his world and tries to bring it into Eddie's. And we see that doesn't work, though. So we've kind of established our rules here. Something can be taken from Eddie's world into Roland's, and back again, but the same does not work opposite.
Yeah, which from a physics point of view makes no sense, but from a magic point of view, fine, whatever.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it does. Like, there's not too much we can like build off of this right now, because we don't really know. But I think it is like interesting that we've established this. Like, it makes the worlds unique, and it makes this idea that things in Eddie's world maybe have more permanence than things in Roland's.
Yeah, right. I mean, it reminds us of this idea from before that like his world has moved on. His world is maybe some kind of afterlife, and you can maybe go to the afterlife and then return, but you can't take a piece of the afterlife back with you.
Sure. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, the whole exercise of testing the portal is so great, especially how Roland just kind of falls into a limp pile when he goes through the door and his consciousness leaves his body. Yeah. So, yeah, we also already kind of knew some of this, right? Like the presence of Jake on Roland's world, and the fact that the Man in Black can seemingly move fairly freely back and forth, or at least that's hinted at. We know that transit is possible. If anything, the fact that Roland can't go through the door is interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like, it seems that, well, I mean, what we know here is that the Man in Black is able to travel back and forth. We know Roland is able to go in, but he can't bring anything with him. So it's like living things from Roland's world can seemingly go into the door, or at least two of them. we don't know how the Man in Black got there, but two living things can travel into Eddie's world. No inanimate things seem to be able to.
Makes me suspect that the Man in Black is originally from Earth.
Interesting.
Just mechanically speaking, it seems like if we're following the simple rules laid out here, then the Man in Black can things can come from Earth and then back. That's fine, and that's what maybe what he did. But Roland being from this world, yeah, I don't know. It's just a thought. I mean, it's entirely possible that we'll later learn, like, no, this door has its own special rules. That's not. These aren't the rules of the world. They're just the rules of this door. So
right, and for all we know, this is Roland's door. Right,
yeah.
This belongs to him and him alone. We don't know, but we know that he has a power, and it seems to be connected to this door.
Yeah.
So the plane lands, and Jane and her flight attendant teammate have managed to notice that no, Eddie's not going to try to hijack the plane, but he did bend over, and they saw the drugs stuffed under his arms. Like, was this like an 80s thing? Like, there's got to be better places to put these drugs than under your armpits.
I feel like this is pretty. They hadn't figured it out stuff yet, you know.
Sure. The point is that the flight attendants tell the captain, and suddenly we realize we're in a race against time. And I love Roland's frustration here again at the fact that he's noticed Jane notice, and Roland has managed to, just by observation, work this entire thing out, and Eddie is just blissfully unaware.
Yeah.
The gunslinger wondered how the man whose mind had become temporarily home for the gunslinger's own Ka could be so stupid. Some of it was what he was putting into his body, of course, one of this world's version of devilweed. Some, but not all. He was not soft and observant like the others, but in time he might be. They are as they are because they live in the light, the gunslinger thought suddenly, that light of civilization you were taught to adore above all other things. They live in a world which has not moved on. I think that's really fascinating because, like, we're talking about light and darkness here, right? Roland's world is a world that lives in darkness, and this world is one that lives in light, and that light has made them lazy. And he wonders for a moment here if it's better to live in a world of darkness because you're more aware and smart, even though he was taught to worship this world of light.
And this seems really important to me because Roland has so far only been exposed to this very narrow slice of our world, and a somewhat seedy slice at that. So I suspect part of his journey might be coming to see the good side of civilization and the light, the side worth saving or worth adoring, at least.
Yeah. Cool.
Because I mean, I think our world's better than his shithole desert planet. Honestly.
Sure. I just think I love the contradiction though, because the light of civilization was something he was taught and trained to adore above all other things. And then he's seeing like modern America, the version of that, like the most crystallized, like version of civilization. And he's like, nah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's really interesting.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting in various ways, right? It says a lot about him, and it gives me ideas about where we might be taking his character.
Sure. Yeah. I also just want to mention, like, this is the first time Ka has really come up in this book, and it's used in a little bit different connotation here.
It almost means soul here.
Yeah. And I think, like, we've been talking about Ka as just like we've been substituting in the word destiny and karma, and I think we're complicating it a little bit here. I think we're saying it's more than just that.
Yeah, that definitely threw me. I was like, okay, hold on, this throws my simplistic. It's just their word for karma, for a loop. So yeah. All
right. So Roland recognizes that the only way to get the drugs off Eddie with enough time is to make contact with him. And so he does. So now in this book, we have Roland and Eddie communicating telepathically inside Eddie's head. And it's a really fascinating scene. It's like almost this like Eddie is reacting to Roland's arcane and what he describes as almost cute language, while like dealing with the craziness of this pretty well.
Yeah, I think King throws us a bit of a wink by having Eddie think of it as almost cute, because he's like, yeah, you're supposed to think this is funny.
Yeah.
But like swing back and forth between funny and exciting, I think.
Yeah. And I think we see Roland channel a little bit of Court here as well, where he is yelling at Eddie and he says, "Straighten up, maggot. They're suspicious enough without you looking as if you've gone crazy." And it's so funny to me because we've seen Court as this like hated but also loved important person in Roland's life. He's kept referring back to him. He's thought about him constantly, but he's never really channeled him in this way. Like he never really channeled Court with Jake before.
Yeah, Jake was someone he felt like a fatherly caring for, and it's almost like Eddie is someone that he sees as someone who could be sharpened up into a man.
Sure.
Whatever Roland would consider that to mean, but he's on the wrong path and he needs some tough love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Roland manages to convince Eddie that he's just a perfectly normal voice in his head, and he just has to deal with that. Maybe it's the drugs, maybe it's that deep steel underneath Eddie, but he just accepts it pretty quickly, relatively. Or maybe he just realizes he literally has no other choice, because as soon as the plane arrives at the gate, Eddie rushes back into the bathroom. That's like the third time he's been in the bathroom. And Roland manages to yank him into his world. So now Eddie is fully in on the beach now.
Yeah, I think the reason why this works and why it's not like jarring that Eddie just accepts this is that King has crafted the situation so well that it just forces Eddie to accept it because there's no other choice. The danger is obvious. Even if he's going crazy, even if he's having a mental breakdown right now, the rational conclusion is like, all right, I'll deal with the mental breakdown and the hallucination later. I have to deal with this drug smuggling thing right now. Mm-hmm. So that's what he's doing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, it's one of those moments where, like, as you're a writer, you're like, I think it makes sense for the character to question the craziness of this, but I really just need them to do the thing. And so you kind of just write that into your writing, that, like, just create a situation where you just weigh priorities,
right? And
we'll deal with that later.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So Eddie is now on the beach with Roland, and we once again get to see Roland described by Eddie. And this time it's not just its eyes, it's all of him. Yet, however, we go back to a description of his eyes. Yeah, like he sees Roland as a guy who's sick, he's dying of blood poisoning, he's got dried blood, and he's pale. But again, when Eddie looks at Roland's eyes, he says it sees blue, steady, sane. The eyes were alive and full of terrible and tenacious vitality. And it's like he's like almost blown away by the fact that this person that's clearly dying still has so much life left in their eyes. And it's just like, I just feel like we've been King really wants to hit this beat of the power and the life that exists inside Roland's soul, his spirit.
Yeah, he seems so supernaturally awesome here. Like, the part when his hand is shaking horribly because he's like starving to death and has, sepsis and he's holding the knife and then he's like, wait, and then he just like wills his hand to like perfect stillness and steadiness.
Yeah.
And Eddie's like, he can like feel the force coming off of him. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And you can kind of see a few, like you immediately see why Eddie is going to is like going along with this whole thing. Like there's this almost immediate level of respect here for this badass that Eddie sees. I like part of this description is like the smooth wood of their hand grip seem to glow with their own inner light. It's almost as if Eddie sees the magic coming off of the guns that are sitting at his hip. Yeah. Like it's just this super powerful description of Roland here, who despite dying is this monster of a man to Eddie Dean. And like you have to wonder, like it seems like the most important person in Eddie's life right now is his brother Henry, who he has this complicated relationship with, and then we're brought to see this person, and I think we can make comparisons to Jake's interaction with Roland, where he had this father that he couldn't stand that kind of ignored him, and then he is thrust into this world and sees Roland as this almost picturesque father figure that matches the Western cowboys he watches on his TV. And now again, we have Eddie seeing this like badass, like totally in control guy. It's interesting.
It definitely seems like there are some parallels between Eddie and Jake being set up here. This idea that they look at Roland and they see a cowboy, they see a father figure potentially. I mean, I don't want to make predictions at this point because I think it could go any which way, but paralleling him to Jake definitely opens up some possibilities.
Yeah.
I for some reason I just like thought this was the funniest thing in the world, especially the way the audiobook does it, where he goes into the bathroom and he's waiting basically waiting for Roland to do something. And it's like it feels like the moment lasts forever, and then he thinks, "Oh God, oh Christ, I imagined it all. Oh Jesus, how crazy could I get ready?" A grim voice said, "I can't do it alone." And it just made me laugh the way the audiobook reader did an especially good job switching from this like losing it voice back, in instant cut to Roland's voice. It was just this fantastic gold comedy.
Awesome.
Anyway,
awesome. All right, so what follows is this like super intense section of the novel written, I think, brilliantly by King, as Roland and Eddie work as quickly as possible to get the tape holding the drugs off of Eddie before the plane departs, and the extremely suspicious pilot breaks down the bathroom door. It's so intense. And I love, like, King keeps making problems pop up. Like, Eddie accidentally cuts himself with Roland's super sharp knife. How's he going to explain how he randomly has a cut? You got to assume when he's, like, sitting on this beach, he's going to get some, like, sand on himself. How the fuck is he going to explain how he has sand all over him? He's got this super obvious tape mark along his chest when they rip the tape off of him. How's he going to explain that? So we're doing this, like, interdimensional drug smuggling in our cowboy fantasy book, and yet it just, like, works. It just works perfectly.
Yeah. I don't know. It's great.
It really is.
Like if I wasn't already sold on the story, which I was, then this would clinch it, I think, because everything in this book has actually been culminating in this intense moment of, like, the pilots banging on the door, Eddie and Roland finally interacting face to face in the bathroom. What are we going to do with the drugs? We got to get rid of this tape. We got to solve the tape problem, and just frantically solving these problems. It's so good.
Yeah. And it's just like there's just a bit of like, you get kind of so swept up into the problem solving that you forget the absurdity of the situation a little bit. Like, this is a cowboy that was inside your brain that has pulled you onto a beach where a frameless door is sitting, and you're now frantically ripping off the tape to have him hold on to your drugs for you so you can clear customs at the airport. Like, it's insane. But you get so swept up into it that it doesn't, like, you don't blink at it. It's just like, yeah, obviously that's the solution.
I think I was kind of, like, reeling at the absurdity of it at first, and then by the time I, like, finished this, this week's reading, I was like, okay, yep.
Right,
makes sense.
One thing I noticed this time was that, like, Roland does not know Eddie's name throughout the entirety of this section, and he's just calling him the prisoner the whole time, because Eddie never says his name. And I think there's this great moment where he realizes that the guy that interacts with Eddie in Eddie's dream or memory of the interaction back in Nassau, like, didn't know Eddie's name either, so he never said it out loud. So he just doesn't know what Eddie's name is, and he keeps calling him the prisoner, and Eddie's always like, what is that? Why do you keep calling me that? It strikes me as, like, an interesting thing that this book has done, because, like, I remember that King kept Roland's name from us through the entire first part of Gunslinger, and while we know Eddie's name, Roland does not.
Yeah, and he thinks specifically at some point about how names have power, right?
Yeah,
and which is a very classic fantasy idea. But I wonder if the fact that he, like, once he learns Eddie's name, does something change? I wonder. That would be interesting.
Yeah, I guess we're gonna find out.
Yep.
Roland and Eddie managed to pull off their amazing drug smuggling heist and get the drugs off Eddie and allow him to leap back into the plane bathroom just on time. He sits down just as the captain bangs down the door. And I love this interaction because, like, the best part about it is literally everyone on this plane knows exactly what's happened. Like, well, Eddie has drugs on him. Like, there and like everyone knows it, and yet he doesn't because of magic. So, like, it's one of those things where everyone's just kind of going through the motion. Like, I love the part where he's managed to pull his pants down and he's sitting on the toilet, and they're like, why didn't you open the door? And he's like, oh, I couldn't reach it. and there's this moment where King has Eddie go, like, reach out and then, like, be comforted by the fact that he actually couldn't reach it. Like, he was just bullshitting it before he tested it, and there's like, oh, phew, it turned out to be true.
Yeah.
And then he stands up, and I think it's one of the captains or one of the guards is like, no shit. And he means that there's no shit in the toilet because Eddie didn't actually shit. And he's like, yeah, sorry, I couldn't. Yeah. And it's just like, everyone knows this is bullshit.
Yeah.
And yet they're going to be powerless to do anything about it because the thing they're looking for is in a magical beach.
Yeah. I love it when the pilot or one of the guys is thinking, like, it's like no one ever taught him the trick of leaning forward. It was great. It was so good.
Yeah.
And so, okay. Stephen King is, I think, really good at throwaway characters, and I have to pull up, well, pardon me for living, I guess I just fell off the hearse. Which the old woman character who's treated like shit by everyone else, and then practically knocked over on her way off the plane. Just, I mean, really quite inconsequential tertiary character who's probably never going to be seen again. But just, I love this idea of this, frantic, overwhelmed woman who, I don't know. I love his little side characters, and I look forward to many more of them as the course of the book goes on.
They're so fun. They are, like, even ones that like that, like, spoilers, we're never going to see that woman ever again.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. They still get just a little inkling of characterization. He still takes the time to do that. Yeah, it's great. It's really great.
Yeah, I mean,
but,
just the line "pardon me for living" is like,
yeah.
It's like, I bet he heard someone actually say that in real life and decided to put it in his book.
Yeah, I bet you're right. So Eddie gets arrested and carted away, and that's where the chapter ends. So we'll have to wait till next week to find out how Eddie's going to explain the nonsense of everything that just happened.
Yeah, I honestly, I mean, it was rough because it's basically been 2 weeks since I read that the first time, and now
you read it super early, didn't you?
Yeah, I'm dying to continue.
Well, you can begin in like 2 minutes.
Okay, all right.
All right, Matt, let's get some speculations. What's going to happen next? Or not next, but what are your speculations?
Well, next, I don't know. I suspect that he's going to be arrested, and then they're not going to be able to find the drugs. And I also suspect in the near term we're going to meet his brother. But I also suspect my actual formal prediction is at some point we're going to get some flashbacks featuring an adult Cuthbert.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I like it.
Okay.
All right. We did not have a discussion question last week, so really nothing to discuss as far as audience. I do want to point out that one of our listeners, Megafire, who's someone that's been part of our community for a long time, mentioned when we were talking about voluntary versus involuntary sacrifice last week, mentioned Avengers Infinity War and Endgame and 2 moments of sacrifice in those movies and how they are viewed completely different based on the voluntary or involuntary nature of them. And I'm almost like mad at myself for not recognizing that. Actually, I'm more mad at you because you love those movies.
I do love those movies, and
I do too. But
I mean,
you more.
I mean, it's pretty unusual that idea, the idea of sacrificing another person in modern fiction, at least. I mean, I get that it was kind of all over the place in religion, but yeah, no, I mean, that's. I don't necessarily want to go so far as to say that, like, Infinity War was inspired by Stephen King.
I don't think so.
But it is a really interesting connection, obviously. So
yeah. I like that. So we got to look for Lord of the Rings connections. We got to look for Marvel connections.
I didn't have any Lord of the Rings connections in this episode.
That's the first one, right?
If anything, I had some Narnia references, but those weren't really serious connections. It was just more like, yep, doors to other worlds. That's sure. Narnia.
I mean, we didn't have a Lord of the Rings connection, but we did talk about Mount Doom and Frodo, so that's true. Got it in.
Oh, you're right. And see, I didn't even notice that. That was just the way I talk normally in daily life.
Whenever you open your mouth, it's something to do with hobbits. It's getting out of hand.
It's true.
Man. It really is.
You think he's joking, folks?
All right. As for this week's discussion question, I want you guys out there to talk about how Roland in the opening chapters of this novel is different from the Roland we saw back in the Gunslinger. How is he different? How is he treated differently? How do we see him a little bit differently? Really explore that and talk about that.
Yeah. Cool.
All right, so that's it for us here on Kingslingers this week. We will be back next week to wrap up part 1, The Prisoner, of this book. We're going to read chapters 4 and 5 of The Prisoner and find out what happens to Eddie Dean.
Cool. I can't wait to do that. And remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at doofmedia.
Yeah, and your answers to the discussion question can be emailed to us at that email right there, kingslingerspod@gmail.com, or via YouTube comments if you're listening via YouTube, or you can go over to our subreddit, that's r/doofmedia, and find the post there for this episode, and you can leave your discussion question there. Any way you want to do it, we'll find it, and we'll talk about it on the show.
Yeah.
And if you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, I mean, you're listening, why not?
Yeah, just click the button.
Yeah, you can find the show everywhere. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, pretty much anywhere else podcasts can be found. Anywhere. Anywhere. You can find it there.
Yeah, and if you like any of our shows, including this one, obviously, and you want to support them, then please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. If you donate to us at the $5 level, you will get access to our monthly Doof and Chill sessions where we live stream just some fun times with other members of the Doof crew for a couple hours, as well as a bunch of other cool bonuses. So go check that out.
Yeah, tons of cool stuff. And if you cannot afford to donate to us right now, of course, that's absolutely okay. You can and still help us out by sharing this podcast with everyone you know, literally all of them, whether they like Stephen King or not. I'm sharing with my dad, and he hates Stephen King. Or we posted on the Dark Tower subreddit for the first time last week, and we got great response there. So if you're listening to us from the Dark Tower subreddit, hey, thank you so much for joining us. You guys, would you share the show? Also, I don't want to spam that subreddit, but maybe you can.
Yeah.
Or another way to help us is by leaving us a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Liz295, who gives us 5 stars and says, "Do you like insightful, smart, and eye-opening literary analysis? Yes, I do. Do you like hanging out with cool, funny, and chill dudes? Oh my God, I think they're talking about us. Do you have no idea what the Dark Tower books are, and in fact have never read Stephen King in your entire life like me? Well, no, that's not true. Watch these guys." I got into them from their We've Got Worm Ward Sleep series, and I love re-experiencing Worm from Scott's fresh, innocent point of view, all while commiserating with Matt doing his best trying to keep a straight face during all of it. Now I get to be the newbie. I just downloaded the audiobook to follow along. If you are new or a veteran of King, listen to these guys. It feels just like hanging out with your best friends talking about nerdy things. Thank you so much, Liz. One of the really cool things, Matt, is that we do have some old members of our community that have been with us for a long time, kind of undertaking this journey with you. And that's, I think, something we haven't really experienced on any of our shows before. I think the Worm one, at least, is, I think most of the people listening to that show probably had already read the book while they were following along with us. But we have a lot of people that are experiencing this for the first time. And I'm really enjoying seeing your reactions and all of theirs. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's really cool for me to pay attention to their reactions too, because it gives me ideas and shows me maybe other ways of looking at certain things as I'm going along, but in a way that's not spoiling anything for me. So that's actually a pretty cool opportunity, I feel.
Yeah. So if you are a constant reader and you're like, I've tried to get my friends to read these damn books and they're just not doing it, maybe ply them with a podcast and it's not just sitting and reading by yourself. It's reading collectively and experiencing it collectively with a bunch of other people. So maybe that's the way you can finally get them in to the Dark Tower, because I think we both know they're really going to love it.
Yeah, we're going on a quest together for this Dark Tower. And
hopefully I will not throw Matt down a pit to get there.
I mean, if you have to, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that kindness. It's the voluntary sacrifice that I really appreciate there, Matt.
Yeah, well, good.
All right, folks, we will see you here back next week as we continue with Book 2, The Drawing of the Three. Once again, we are concluding Part 1, The Prisoner, by discussing chapters 4 and 5. So finish that and stop when you get to Part 2. Don't read that part. Stop there. Or you can go on. I'm not your parent. Do whatever you want. All right, guys. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.